We continue to develop a language of prayer for the journey of faith by praying the pilgrim songs of Israel. This Song of Ascent, 126, picks up the theme of returning from exile to explore God's restorative activity among his people. If we consider the likely historical context of this psalm, this is a song sung by those who returned to Jerusalem from the 70-year exile spent in Babylon. The pain of the previous generations as Babylon loomed, struck, and eventually destroyed the very temple of Jerusalem is replaced by laughter. Yet, as we will see, this psalm anticipates even further restoration. Let's read from the NIV. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. It may help to briefly recount the history of Israel to better understand the gravity of this song's sentiment. God had rescued Israel from Egypt, drawn them to Sinai, and after entering into a covenant with them, installed them in the Promised Land. And it was there they were to be a kingdom of priests, a microcosm of what God promised to do for the whole world through Abraham's descendants. Rather than live as restored people, however, the Israelites cycled again and again into lifestyles that went against the grain of this holy vocation. Infidelity to God expressed itself as idolatry and injustice. They had become as corrupt as the nations they replaced. So what would God do? Well, as we know, he is slow to anger. Tracing through the narrative of Judges, the books of Samuel, and the books of the Kings, it is clear that despite many highlights, where Israel did seem to embody their vocation, they largely backed away from God and his unique purposes for their lives, generation after generation. The prophets, such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel, whom had already been carried into exile, revealed God's intentions. He would indeed enact the covenant curses and remove Israel, his very people, from the Promised Land. Ezekiel gives us the theological lenses to see the disaster at hand. It is not really Babylon that comes to claim victory, but God himself using international warfare for his redemptive purposes. Yes, it is tough to see exile in line with God's agenda for global redemption, but the exile was formative. Isaiah, prophesying generations before, had already beheld God's new exodus, as God would again bring Israel back into the Promised Land. In fact, Isaiah had glimpsed the geopolitical scenario for their redemption, prophesying Cyrus of Persia's meteoric rise. History records the unthinkable scenario Isaiah foresaw in chapter 45 of his prophetic writings. Cyrus actually takes over Babylon with no casualties. He replaces the culture-disrupting program of exile and relocation with a policy of pious generosity, encouraging Israel to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of Yahweh. Cyrus, according to Ezra and the chronicler, identifies Yahweh, God of the Hebrews, as the originator of his success. For this generation of Israel, God would put on display once more his purposes for his people as the world watched. Now let's return to our prayer here. Is that not the kind of narrative that would cause you to scratch your head and ask, am I dreaming? You mean to tell me that our new conqueror wants us to return to our homeland and worship not him nor his deity, but our God, whom he feels is stirring his spirit to stoke worship in our God? Are you for real? It's crazy. It's incredulous. It's laughable. And yet, here it stands. This is God's activity. But isn't this how he has shown up before and after this narrative? Wouldn't you laugh with Sarah, an elderly woman, at the thought of her cradling her own newborn? Wouldn't you laugh with the mourning crowd at Jesus' claim that the dead daughter of the synagogue ruler is in fact alive? It's crazy the way God works. You ever been there? feeling like God's activity in your own fortunes is nearly laughable? That thing that was going to be impossible, that moment your bank account was supposed to bottom out, that time you were sure you were all alone? When God acts in restoration, it can drive us to the laughter of relief, irony, and I would even say worship. Perhaps this prayer shows us that laughter can be an offering to God. Karl Barth, the famed Swiss theologian, said, "Laughter is the closest thing to the grace of God." In your prayers, what do you laugh with God about? Enjoy with God the intimacy of laughter. It shows. This psalm has the thrust of mission. God's restoration in your life is on display. Indeed, the psalmist here notes that the nations took note and commented, Yahweh has done great things for them. I'm reminded here of the thread we see with God's global redemption plan running through Abraham, through Israel, which ultimately is fulfilled by Christ. God would bless the world through Abraham's descendants, giving them a law and a way of life that would bear witness to the nearness of God and the restoration of relationship with him. Thus, what God would do with them would ripple through the world. This is the global mission that was at stake every time Israel shunned its relationship with God. And now, God's ridiculous rescue is on display. When we talk about our lives, do we invite others to see God's activity? Let's pray with an aim towards sharing God's redemption with those around us. Yet, there seems to be more fortune turning to hope for. You see, when they got back home, there was celebration and unease. The walls were demolished, the temple a shell. If this song was sung in the days of Nehemiah and the rebuilders, the backdrop of return was encouraging, yes, but bleak. Could this be all they had hoped for? A city haunted by its failures? A husk of its former glory? Have you ever felt like that? Okay, God, thanks for rescuing me, but this is it? I'm still broken, still prone to fail. My church isn't perfect. My family's still struggling. Is this it? This song invites the worship procession into the tension of the already and the not yet. The returners were celebrating God's restoration, yet just a few lines later, they plea for it afresh. Restore our fortunes, Lord. They were renewed, freed from the land of captivity, but sitting in the rubble of their homeland, they look for further restoration. Whatever they had hoped for wasn't quite complete. So they sang a song celebrating restoration while anticipating even more restorative activity from God. This is the kind of plea we Christians make. God has restored us. He has brought us into relationship with himself. We are new creations. Yet, we aren't finished. Nor is he. One day his restoration will come in full. Until then, we sing this song, anchored in hope. What God has done before in part, he will do soon in full. Active hope is the song of the redeemed. The imagery of hope is quite evocative. The Negev, a desert wilderness, flooding with deep streams of life-giving water. Once again, the psalmists have invited us into the poetry of prayer, finding words and images to root our devotion into. Let this image saturate, pun intended, your prayer life. God's restorative activity is this incredible. If you feel as bone dry as a desert wasteland, God's redemptive motions are world-changing, just as rushing waters are. That's indeed the kind of ironic hope the psalmist closes with. Another theme that runs through prayers such as Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel or Mary's Magnificat in Luke is the hope of a great reversal. You feel it in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God is doing a new thing. What he did for slaves in Egypt, what he did for exiles in Babylon, what he did for Hannah, Mary, Sarah, and the many others we read about, that's what he's doing in us through Christ. Our exodus, our return is happening even now in the already and not yet. We find joy in God through the pains of this world. So, wherever you are right now, when you pray this prayer, whether your mouth be filled with laughter or your fields with tears. Know this, one day there will be no more tears. Let this song stoke hope when you are down and when you are up. Pray with laughter, pray with tears, and most of all, pray with hope in Yahweh, who works all things for the good of those who love him.